a sun-scorched ridge overlooking the Tunisian desert. Oberst Friedrich Müller squinted through his binoculars, sweat running down his brow, as the first American M4 Sherman tanks rumbled into view, their olive-green hulls glinting under the North African sun, engines humming in perfect synchrony, tracks carving clouds of dust across terrain German Panzer crews had considered ideal for ambush. He turned to Lieutenant Wilhelm Kroer, noting the way the younger officer's hands trembled, and whispered, "My God! They call these toys, yet here they come, relentless, unyielding, unafraid." And in that moment, amid the distant rumble of artillery and the keen scent of cordite, Müller understood something that would haunt every German officer from Tunisia to the Rhine. This was not merely a tank, not merely a force of men and steel, but a manifestation of American industrial might, a machine of production and persistence that defied every lesson the Wehrmacht had internalized about armored warfare. The Sherman was neither elegant like the Panther, nor monstrous like the Tiger. Yet its value lay not in perfection but in endurance, adaptability, and sheer numbers, and as Müller watched, the desert air thick with smoke and sand, he saw crews emerging from the tanks with practiced efficiency, loading ammunition, coordinating movements, and striking in waves, flanking the elite German armor with a combination of mobility and tactical ingenuity that German doctrine had always considered impossible. And as the day wore on, Panzer crews found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned in unexpected moments, and overwhelmed by a relentless tide of machines that could be repaired, refueled, and returned to battle faster than any one Tiger or Panther could be replaced. And in the weeks that followed, from the scorched hills of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, the Sherman would evolve, with British engineers fitting the Firefly variant with a 17-pounder cannon capable of piercing Tiger armor at a mile, and American mechanics installing wider tracks, flamethrowers, and mobile artillery modifications, transforming what had been derided as a toy into a versatile platform, a node in a vast logistical and strategic network that German officers could neither anticipate nor counter. And when Operation Overlord commenced on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy erupted in chaos, smoke, and fire, with Shermans clawing up sand dunes under machine gun fire and artillery bombardment. Many destroyed immediately, yet for every fallen tank, 2 more replaced it, creating a psychological shock among German defenders, who, trained to calculate losses and assume attrition would slow advances, now saw themselves facing an endless wave, a swarm tactic they could not comprehend, and as columns of tanks pressed inland, artillery, infantry, and fighter bombers operated in perfect coordination, turning every hill, river, and destroyed village into a chessboard where American forces dictated the tempo, exploiting every weakness, repairing every vehicle, maintaining morale, and sustaining operations with industrial efficiency that German officers like General Otto Elfelt, when later captured, described as a factory of war projected onto the battlefield, a system beyond our comprehension. And as Patton's Third Army raced across France, the scale of American logistical genius became evident in the form of the Red Ball Express, a continuous stream of trucks, drivers working in shifts, each vehicle standardized, maintained and loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations, delivering more to frontline units in a single hour than entire German divisions could muster in a month. And Oberst Hans Rüdiger, observing from the Ardennes in December 1944, wrote in his diary that he witnessed not an army, but a conveyor belt, a river of fuel and steel that turned the very concept of warfare upside down, and captured German officers consistently echoed this realization. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a manifestation of American industrial philosophy, replaceable, adaptable, and abundant, combined with a logistics system that allowed every tactical engagement to be sustained indefinitely. And when Panther and Tiger units encountered these waves, the battle was no longer one of individual brilliance but of endurance, supply, and coordination, with German forces breaking down not because of inferior tactics or courage, but because their calculations of supply, replacement, and operational tempo had been rendered obsolete by an army that projected the full might of a nation onto every battlefield. And as the war pressed into the winter of 1944-45, through the forests of the Ardennes, across the bridges over the Rhine, and into the ruins of German towns, the Sherman, once mocked as a toy, led armored columns in a relentless advance, engines growling, stars shining through smoke, maintaining operational tempo even as individual vehicles were lost, while German units ran out of fuel, ammunition, and hope, and interrogated officers, from Oberst Friedrich Müller to General Heinrich Ebbebach, reflected that their defeat was not caused by superior firepower, strategy, or heroism, but by the industrialized system that sustained Sherman operations, a combination of American factory production, logistical innovation, and tactical coordination that German doctrine could not counter. And in post-war memoirs, these officers repeatedly emphasized the psychological impact. The Americans did not fight as an army, they fought as a system, a nation armed with standardized tanks, supply trucks, mechanics, and engineers, where every loss was temporary, every setback a calculation to be corrected. And as the final months of the war saw Shermans crossing into Berlin, German generals acknowledged that their understanding of warfare, honed over centuries, had been confronted by an entirely new paradigm, one in which endurance, industrial capacity, and systemic efficiency had proven more decisive than individual tactical genius, and the legacy of the Sherman, of its mass production, adaptability, and the unstoppable waves that overwhelmed elite German armor, became a foundational case study in modern warfare, demonstrating that in a mechanized industrial age, victory belongs not to the side with the most brilliant tanks or generals, but to the side that can sustain, replace, and coordinate relentlessly, and as Oberst Müller later recounted in captured diaries. We fought the Sherman as if it were a machine, but we were wrong. We were fighting an idea, a system, a nation itself projected into steel and fire, and thus the toy that German generals mocked became the embodiment of American industrial democracy applied to war, crushing armies, rewriting doctrine, and leaving a legacy where logistics, production, and adaptability defined victory, a lesson the world would carry into the nuclear age, mechanized conflicts, and every battlefield where industrial power met human courage, proving that endurance, systemization, and relentless production could overcome perfection, isolation, and the fearsome reputation of any single weapon. And the Sherman, from Tunisia to Normandy to the Ardennes to the heart of Germany, became the symbol of that revelation, forever redefining what it meant to wage war in the industrial age. September 3, 1943, the craggy hills of Sicily. Oberleutnant Karl Dietrich crouched behind a ruined farmhouse, field glasses pressed to his eyes, as he watched the advancing wave of Shermans navigating narrow mountain passes, their engines echoing off stone cliffs and sending birds scattering into the sky. The German defenders had positioned Panzer IVs and a handful of Tigers along choke points, hoping terrain would amplify their firepower, but the Americans, as if rehearsed by some mechanical intelligence, spread their tanks in formations that allowed overlapping fields of fire, while infantry moved in tandem, flamethrowers at the ready, engineers following close behind to remove mines and barricades, and Dietrich noted, with an unease that gnawed at his stomach, that every Sherman destroyed was promptly replaced, every disabled hull stripped and repaired by teams of mechanics who emerged from the dust like shadows, lifting turrets, replacing engines, welding armor under fire, and in a single hour he counted 15 new tanks. Emerging from the valley behind the first wave, each one gleaming, fresh, and ready to fight, and it became immediately apparent that German doctrine, which had glorified the decisive strike, the singular engagement, the individual heroism of panzer crews, was rendered impotent against this relentless system, for the Shermans, unlike their elite adversaries, were expendable, their value not in perfection or fearsome reputation, but in persistence, numbers, and coordination, and as the Sicilian sun rose higher, Dietrich witnessed the horrifying efficiency of combined arms. Artillery targets were softened from miles away, bombers roared overhead, strafing positions, smoke shells obscured line of sight, infantry engaged in carefully timed assaults, and the Shermans exploited every opening, maneuvering to flank, withdraw, and strike again in an endless rhythm that German minds could neither predict nor disrupt. And when the Americans captured Messina, they had done so not through tactical brilliance alone, but through the synchronization of production, logistics, and battlefield application, with replacement tanks arriving as quickly as casualties were taken, ammunition flowing like water, and medical units evacuating the wounded before German units could react. And the psychological impact on German officers was profound, with generals like Oberstleutnant Hans Müller later recounting that entire nights were spent recalculating possibilities, trying in vain to imagine a supply system capable of sustaining such momentum, and yet every calculation collapsed under the weight of reality, as American Shermans kept coming, rolling through the chaos with mechanical inevitability. And when the campaign shifted to mainland Italy, with its narrow valleys, rivers, and fortified towns, German units discovered that even terrain advantages could not halt a tide that had learned to adapt, innovate, and improvise in real time, for Shermans were modified with wider tracks to handle mud and snow, hulls reinforced to withstand artillery, and crews trained to coordinate with engineers, artillery, and aircraft in a way that made every battlefield a network system of firepower, mobility, and repair. And when Operation Avalanche commenced at Salerno, German defenders, expecting attrition to slow American advances, found instead a synchronized assault where every obstacle was met with pre-planned solutions, every destroyed vehicle replaced, every supply line maintained. Through a combination of trucks, airlifts, and local depots, and as Oberstleutnant Dietrich watched a Sherman column push through a minefield while engineers cleared paths ahead, he noted the impossibility of stopping this machine, realizing that German tactics had been designed for a war of scarcity, and the Americans were fighting a war of abundance, where logistics, industrial production, and relentless replacement multiplied every tactical unit into a force 10 times its apparent size. And this realization crystallized during the Anzio campaign, when Sherman crews, operating from temporary beachheads, moved inland, cleared fortified positions, and coordinated with artillery observers who directed fire with unprecedented accuracy, and German panzer divisions, though still superior in armor and individual firepower, found themselves continuously outflanked, outpaced, and psychologically unnerved, as every captured or destroyed tank seemed to be replaced immediately by a new one, fresh crews appearing with the same efficiency as a factory assembly line. And as winter approached in late 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders again encountered the terrifying inevitability of the Sherman system, with tanks pushing through forests under snow, engineers rapidly repairing destroyed bridges, fuel delivered continuously by convoys that German units could not intercept, and air support coordinating with ground units in a seamless ballet that rendered static defensive positions meaningless. And in captured war diaries, officers like Major Klaus Friedrich wrote that for every strategic position they held, the Americans had created a system that made holding or losing ground irrelevant, that Shermans were not weapons but nodes in a network, not individual tanks but components of an unstoppable machine whose power lay in endurance, adaptability, and industrial support. And when the Allies crossed the Rhine, Shermans led armored columns into the heart of Germany, rolling through ruined towns and cities, engines growling, crews calm and methodical, ammunition and fuel replenished continuously, while German officers noted that the American approach was not just tactical or operational, but philosophical. They had transformed warfare into a system of production, supply, and coordinated execution, rendering individual heroism secondary to industrial endurance. And by the end of the war, generals like Otto Elfelt and Hans von Löringhoven acknowledged that the Sherman's true triumph was not in its gun or armor, but in its ability to integrate battlefield efficiency with industrial output, demonstrating to the world that in modern mechanized warfare, the nation capable of sustaining forces, replacing losses, and coordinating production could outfight even the most elite troops and technologically superior enemy tanks, and that the derided toy that German generals mocked had in fact embodied a revolution in warfare, teaching that in the industrial age, victory belonged not to the battlefield genius, but to the system capable of projecting its entire national capability, material and human, onto the field, a lesson that would echo through NATO doctrine, Cold War planning, and modern military theory, showing that a tank, no matter how small, could become a harbinger of systemic dominance, and that endurance, numbers, and logistics often outweighed perfection. And as captured diaries, post-war interrogations, and memoirs reveal, the Sherman was less a machine and more an idea. That industrialized, coordinated, and relentless application of resources could overwhelm any army, crush its morale, and redefine the very nature of modern 1944, war. The beaches of Normandy. Obersergeant Friedrich Weber's hands were numb from cold and tension as he peered over the crest of Omaha Beach, binoculars scanning a horizon filled with smoke, fire, and the relentless advance of M4 Sherman tanks, their olive-green hulls climbing over obstacles, scraping past mines, and shrugging off machine gun fire that would have stopped lesser vehicles. And Weber, a veteran of panzer divisions in Africa and Russia, felt a cold, sinking dread in his chest as he realized that the American strategy was not dependent on the destruction of individual tanks or the brilliance of commanders, but on a system so vast and well-coordinated that each Sherman was merely one cog in a network designed to absorb losses, sustain momentum, and continuously replace casualties. And as he watched waves of tanks push inland, engineers clearing obstacles, infantry coordinating with artillery and airstrikes, he noted that German defenses, which had been meticulously prepared over months, were already beginning to crumble under the weight of operational tempo, and for every Sherman destroyed, another appeared seemingly out of nowhere, rolling through craters and barbed wire, engines growling, tracks slicing through hedgerows, turning the quaint French countryside into a lethal obstacle course that German troops could neither anticipate nor halt. And as the weeks wore on, the hedgerows of Normandy became theaters of improvisation, where Shermans adapted to terrain with ingenious modifications. Rhino kits to breach thick hedgerows, wider tracks to prevent bogging, and mobile artillery conversions allowing indirect fire without leaving the cover of vegetation. And the psychological toll on German officers was immediate and devastating. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luttwitz, commanding a panzer battalion near Cannes, recorded in his diary that entire nights were spent recalculating defensive plans, only to find that the Shermans bypassed, outflanked, or simply replaced what had been destroyed, and the Germans began calling it the endless green tide, the realization spreading that they were not merely facing tanks, but a force multiplied by logistics, by production, by relentless replacement and coordination. And in captured testimonies after the war, officers consistently noted that American forces operated as a networked organism. Medics, engineers, and supply convoys following tanks in near-perfect synchronization, artillery barrages directed by forward observers and aircraft, providing reconnaissance and strike capability on demand, all sustained by industrial output that German doctrine could not hope to match. And when British units fitted Shermans with 17-pounder guns to create fireflies, panzer crews reported small tanks with monstrous power, their psychological impact as deadly as their physical capabilities, leading to Tiger crews refusing engagement, fearful of traps, and as the campaign moved inland, every town, forest, and river crossing became a demonstration of industrialized warfare. Sherman columns rolling forward, spare engines arriving by airlift, ammunition replenished faster than it could be fired, field repairs conducted under fire, and German panzer units, despite superior armor and gunnery, found themselves constantly reacting to a tide they could not stem, their doctrine, honed over decades, rendered obsolete by a combination of simplicity, mass production, and tactical ingenuity. And when the Americans broke through at St. Lo, tanks advanced in waves, infantry exploiting breaches, engineers repairing bridges in hours, and German officers began recording a dawning truth. The Sherman strength was not in perfection, but in persistence, and the Allied advance was not halted by terrain, weather, or loss of vehicles, for every destroyed Sherman was replaced, every consumed round restocked, every wounded crew member evacuated and replaced, creating a psychological and operational shock that undermined morale. Across the Wehrmacht and captured diaries from panzer divisions reveal repeated reflections that they were fighting a machine, not men, that the Americans brought a nation to the battlefield, that industrial democracy, standardized production, and logistics had become weapons as decisive as guns or tanks, and by August 1944, as Patton's Third Army began its rapid dash across France, German commanders were left paralyzed. Defensive lines meant nothing against an opponent who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, and the Sherman, once derided as a toy, now led armored columns in relentless pursuit, pushing across bridges, through towns, and over rivers, the Red Ball Express delivering fuel and ammunition at a rate that allowed continuous operations, and officers like General Otto Elfolt recorded in post-war interrogations that we were not defeated by soldiers, tactics, or strategy, but by a system, a nation projected onto the battlefield with steel, fuel, and coordination, a machine beyond our ability to stop. And as the campaign culminated in the liberation of Paris and the crossing into eastern France, Shermans continued to demonstrate adaptability. Flame-throwing variants clearing fortifications, mobile artillery providing indirect fire from hidden positions, and infantry tanks coordinating with anti-tank teams to neutralize Panther and Tiger units, turning battles into demonstrations of operational endurance, industrial capacity, and tactical ingenuity. And the German officer corps, forced to retreat repeatedly, came to view the Sherman not as a tank but as a symbol of American industrial democracy, where replacement, supply, and coordination mattered more than perfection, skill, or single-engine firepower. and by the time the Ardennes offensive commenced in December 1944, the German High Command had fully internalized the lesson. They were fighting an idea as much as a weapon, a system designed to absorb losses, maintain momentum, and continuously project national power into combat. And as columns of Shermans rolled through the snow, engineers repairing roads and bridges, medics evacuating casualties, and fuel convoys flowing uninterrupted behind them, German officers like Obersergeant Klaus Friedrich remarked in captured diaries that, "We are no longer fighting tanks or men. We are fighting production, coordination, and endurance itself, and the continuous replacement of lost vehicles, the ability to sustain operations over hundreds of miles, and the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support created a force multiplication effect that rendered even the most powerful German tanks, including the Tiger I and Panther, insufficient to stem the tide, and in post-war analysis, officers repeatedly noted that the Sherman's impact was as psychological as it was tactical, instilling fear and hopelessness, breaking the Wehrmacht's belief in the inevitability of attrition, and showing that industrialized warfare, standardized production, and relentless logistical support could overwhelm skill, training, and elite equipment, and thus the Sherman, once a toy in the eyes of German generals, became the ultimate symbol of how industrial capacity and operational coordination could rewrite the rules of war, a lesson that would influence military doctrine for decades and demonstrate that in the mechanized age, endurance, systems, and logistics often mattered far more than perfection, courage, or individual brilliance. And as the first columns of Shermans crossed into Germany itself, 1944, the snow-laden forests of the Ardennes, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Krüger huddled in a foxhole, frost biting his fingers, as the first whispers of the German counteroffensive reached his ears, and he watched from a ridge as columns of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Tigers moved forward with the desperate fury of men who knew time was slipping away. Yet even as German armor struck, the Americans responded with an almost supernatural resilience. M4 Shermans, outfitted with wider tracks for the treacherous winter mud and snow, advanced in coordinated waves, infantry interlocking with tanks, engineers clearing felled trees and mines while field artillery pounded advancing German units. And Krüger realized with growing horror that German doctrine, which had relied on shock, surprise, and local superiority, was impotent against a force whose operational momentum was sustained not just by vehicles and firepower but by an entire nation's industrial might funneled into the battlefield, with fuel convoys, spare engines, ammunition, and food flowing continuously via the Red Ball Express and forward supply depots, ensuring that every Sherman destroyed would be replaced within hours, that every lost gun would be replenished before the day was out, and that medics evacuated casualties almost as quickly as they occurred. And as snow fell and visibility dropped to mere meters, Shermans adapted. Mobile artillery variants provided indirect fire without exposure, flamethrower tanks cleared bunkers, infantry carrying Shermans transported troops safely through mined roads, and coordination with fighter bombers above created lethal traps for German armor, forcing even Tiger crews to retreat when ambushed by a combination of numbers, maneuver, and air power, and the psychological toll on German officers was immediate and crushing, with diaries and post-war testimonies recording repeated astonishment at the Americans' ability to sustain operations through winter, to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, and to maintain initiative even in the most inhospitable terrain. And Oberstleutnant Krüger noted bitterly that the Americans fought not merely with steel and gunpowder but with the full projection of national industrial power, that their tanks were nodes in a system designed for endurance, and that the Shermans' true strength lay not in individual combat capability but in their integration into a relentless, self-replenishing war machine. And as the days stretched into weeks, German units, despite tactical skill and superior firepower, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered and outpaced, supply lines collapsing under attrition, morale eroding as soldiers witnessed their most formidable tanks immobilized by fuel shortages or minor mechanical failures, while Shermans rolled on with inexhaustible consistency, and captured Wehrmacht officers repeatedly remarked that they were no longer fighting men, no longer fighting tanks, but an idea. The fusion of industrial production, logistics, and battlefield execution projected with ruthless efficiency, and as the snowbound forests echoed with the rumble of engines, artillery, and explosions, the Americans demonstrated an operational philosophy the Germans could neither anticipate nor counter. Abandon the notion of singular decisive engagements, replace attrition with abundance, replace exhaustion with continuous supply, and replace fear of loss with confidence that every destroyed tank, every expended round, every fallen comrade would be replaced and reinforced in a system that calculated victory not in heroic moments but in the relentless, inexorable application of resources, manpower, and coordination. And when the Ardennes offensive faltered, German officers recognized that their failure was not due to flawed tactics alone, but because the Sherman, once derided as a toy, had become the linchpin of a networked force whose industrial backbone made attrition meaningless. And as Kruger's unit retreated through snow-choked roads, he wrote bitterly in a diary later captured by Allied forces, "We fought with courage, with skill, with armor superior in quality, but they fought with a system. We killed tanks. They replaced them. We exhausted ourselves. They endured. We believed in shock and genius. They believed in industry and coordination. This is not war as we knew it. This is the war of nations, not armies. And we lost to a machine we could not stop, a machine built from factories, steel, and the unending will of a people to supply and sustain it." The Ardennes demonstrated the final proof. In mechanized warfare, in the industrial age, endurance, production, and logistics trumped perfection, courage, and tactical brilliance, and the Sherman, in all its seemingly modest glory, was the symbol, the vehicle, and the instrument of that transformation, a rolling testament to the idea that in modern war, a toy, in the right system can crush even the most fearsome army, and that victory belonged not to the side with superior firepower or armor, but to the side that could project its industrial and organizational might faster, more efficiently, and more relentlessly than any opponent, a lesson the Germans would internalize bitterly, permanently, and too late. On German troops. Entire Panther crews refused engagement when confronted with coordinated March 7, 1945, the banks of the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier between Allied forces and the heart of Germany, and Oberst Rudolf Heinemann, commanding a beleaguered panzer unit near Remagen, could hardly believe his eyes as Sherman tanks and their supporting infantry advanced relentlessly. Engineers already repairing bridges demolished by retreating Wehrmacht units, while pontoons and ferries ferried supplies across the river at a pace that defied every pre-war assumption about operational limits, and Heinemann, a veteran of the Eastern Front, watched from a ruined church steeple as tanks surged forward in coordinated columns, artillery barrages following them like clockwork, and aircraft overhead directing strikes on retreating German positions, and it became immediately clear that German doctrines of delaying actions, prepared defensive positions, and concentrated armor were impotent against a force that could replace losses almost instantaneously, and that the Shermans, while individually outgunned by Panthers and Tigers, leveraged mobility, numerical superiority, and the unbroken chain of logistics behind them to overwhelm positions that would have been impregnable months earlier. And as American engineers rebuilt roads, cleared mines, and erected supply dumps mere kilometers from the front, Heinemann noted in his captured diary that German units were running out of fuel, ammunition, and hope, while every destroyed Sherman was replaced within hours, every artillery piece resupplied, and medics evacuated casualties in a manner that preserved combat strength, and captured reports revealed the psychological toll Sherman firefly formations. Soldiers whispered that the Americans cannot be stopped, and senior officers admitted in post-war interrogations that they were facing not merely men and machines but a system, a war machine powered by industrial output, organizational discipline, and unrelenting redundancy. And as columns of Shermans crossed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a structure previously deemed vulnerable to demolition, they rolled into the Rhineland with infantry, engineers, and artillery, while logistical convoys stretched behind them for hundreds of miles, bringing fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, ensuring the advance never stalled. And as Heinemann's unit attempted a counterattack, Panthers immobilized by fuel shortages and Tigers outnumbered and outflanked highlighted the futility of German tactical brilliance against industrialized warfare, and captured journals of German officers repeatedly noted the same theme. The Americans fought not for glory or battlefield heroism, but for the continuous projection of national capacity, and the Sherman was merely the visible tip of a vast, synchronized system that combined manpower, mechanization, and supply into an unstoppable force. And as the weeks progressed, Shermans led armored columns through shattered towns, over bombed-out bridges, and across open plains into the Ruhr, while German units collapsed from exhaustion, disorganization, and the inability to replace lost equipment, and Oberst Heinemann, in his final diary entries before capture, wrote bitterly that we are not defeated by superior tactics or courage. We are defeated by the projection of an entire nation into the field, a system that replaces what we destroy faster than we can calculate, and tanks once mocked as toys lead this relentless tide. And as columns of Shermans rolled through the ruins of Cologne, Dusseldorf, and eventually into central Germany, German officers recognized a devastating truth. The Sherman, once dismissed as inadequate, was the embodiment of a modern concept of war where logistics, production, and operational integration mattered more than individual technical superiority. And by the time Berlin was surrounded and Germany's surrender imminent, the Wehrmacht understood that the crushing force they faced had been built not in secret labs or elite units but in the factories, workshops, and assembly lines of America, and that each Sherman represented the industrial, organizational, and logistical might of a nation mobilized for total war, capable of sustaining momentum where conventional armies would falter. And the testimony of captured German generals, recorded in post-war interrogations, repeatedly echoed this lesson. We did not lose to better tanks or braver men. We lost to a system, to endurance, to industrial power projected without pause onto the battlefield. And thus, the Shermans, rolling endlessly eastward with supply convoys, engineers, artillery, and air support in perfect coordination, became the ultimate symbol of American mechanized warfare, demonstrating that in the industrial age victory was won not merely by individual brilliance or armor, but by the relentless application of a nation's production and organizational power. And in the final analysis, the German generals who had once mocked the Sherman as a toy had witnessed the unthinkable. A machine, supported by an unbroken system of supply and organization, crushing armies, seizing cities, and redefining the meaning of war, proving that endurance, integration, and industrial might could triumph over even the most formidable tactical and technological expertise. By April 1945, as the Rhine had been crossed and American forces poured into the heart of Germany, the once feared Wehrmacht was in full retreat, shattered not by individual battles but by the relentless system that the Shermans symbolized. Columns of tanks moved through bombed-out streets, infantry secured key positions, engineers repaired bridges and cleared obstacles, and behind them stretched the lifeline of convoys, supply depots, and forward maintenance units that ensured that momentum never faltered. And German officers, now prisoners, recorded with bitter clarity that their tactical genius, their elite armored divisions, their vaunted Tiger and Panther tanks, were rendered meaningless against a force that operated like a living factory on wheels, that replaced losses faster than they could inflict them, and that integrated every element of modern warfare: fuel, ammunition, food, repair, medical evacuation, and air support, into a single, unstoppable system. And as the Shermans rolled past the ruins of cities like Cologne, Aachen, and eventually through the outskirts of Berlin, German soldiers whispered in disbelief. They cannot be stopped, realizing too late that the toy tank had been the spearhead of an industrialized army whose strength lay not in perfection but in abundance, adaptability, and relentless execution. And when the surrender came in May, the testimony of German generals consistently emphasized the same lesson. It was not heroism, strategy, or superior technology that had defeated them, but the American capacity to project production, logistics, and organization into the field at a scale the Wehrmacht could not comprehend. And the Sherman, humble in design yet tireless in execution, had become the embodiment of that principle, a rolling testament to the truth that in modern industrial warfare, endurance, coordination, and supply trump skill, courage, and even technological brilliance, proving once and for all that a toy in the right hands, supported by the right system, could crush armies, reshape battlefields, and redefine the art of war for generations to come.